In this lecture, I plan to look at the economic consequences of Alexander the Great's career. And this lecture divides itself into three parts. First, I'd like to discuss what we know about Alexander's activities and how they influenced economic life and changed economic life really not only in the Persian Empire but also the Greek world. And that's an extraordinary achievement on Alexander's part. I mean, he only ruled for a little over 12 years. Nonetheless, those conquests and the need to sustain those campaigns, as well as whatever long-range plans Alexander had, changed the relationships of markets, opened up new trade routes, opened the former Persian Empire to the colonization by Greek cities I discussed in the previous lecture, and all of that had major economic consequences. These consequences can be documented, and the question is, how important were they? And that gets us to the second part of this lecture, and the change of the economic life of the Hellenistic world raises a number of questions in a wider debate on the nature of economic life and activity in the ancient world. And this essentially runs from the Archaic Age in Greece, that is the period from Homer down to the Persian Wars, until the end of the Roman Empire. This whole area known as antiquity has been subject to intense study in certain of its periods to determine how do these periods match up in the overall economic development, the history of economic relationships. And that gets us into a debate that has been going on since the 1920s and 30s as to whether this Hellenistic world really was as prosperous and economically advanced as it seemed to be, whether it was in many ways a capitalist or at least a society based on markets, or are we dealing with very superficial changes wrought by Alexander that only influenced some of the courts, the cities, luxury trade, and that economic life was really not that much affected, that the majority of the population still lived by the rhythm of the seasons. They were peasants, they were engaged in subsistence farming, or maybe some commercial farming that fed only their immediate towns. That is a very important debate. And then I would like to bring to bear some of my own work, especially dealing with the coin finds at Gordian, the site where Alexander loosened the Gordian knot, and especially focus on coins, which are one of our major sources for economic activity, and explain what I think happened is as a consequence of Alexander's conquests. And so from the start, I will have to inform all of you that I tend to stand in that first group, that the economic change was significant. This is not to say that I embrace all of the theories of the authors of the 1920s and 30s, but nonetheless, I think the criticism that was raised in the later part of the 20th century, largely based on Marxist models and the notion that somehow ancient life has to be economically less advanced than medieval in order to have the Marxist dialectics to work, that essentially that's the wrong way to deal with the problem. I tend to be a very empirical historian. I work with the evidence and then I generate my generalizations rather than trying to use a model or some kind of theory and fit the evidence into that. Well, with that warning, let's look at first Alexander's impact. There's no doubt that Alexander drastically transformed the face of the Near East economically. The Persian kings, according to our Greek sources, and this is also backed up by archaeological evidence, the Persian kings did not exact much from their subjects. They amassed enormous reserves of revenue. We think that King Darius III may well have had as much as 350,000 talents in gold and silver specie, and this represented the collection of tribute from across his empire over years. And Alexander captured at least 250,000 of those talents, probably more, and all of this was eventually turned into coin money. A lot of it by Alexander, especially in his later years, and much of it by his successors, especially in the opening years of the wars to partition the empire. All of this gold and silver that had been stockpiled was then in effect put into circulation, and that had major impact on prices and markets across the Near East. The second point I would draw out about Alexander is that he and his successors were committed to a high level of expenditure, and not just for military costs. In the previous lecture, I talked about the foundation of cities, the need for Alexander and later Macedonian kings to act as Philhellenian kings. Well, this cost money. And Persian kings did not have to play the same role. The Achaemenid kings of Persia had their ritual capitals at Persepolis and Pasargadae. That was the two cities in eastern Persia where they collected the tribute. They did lavish patronage. There is no doubt that they endowed certain shrines, that they also had an economic impact because the construction of those ritual capitals drew upon the labor and the materials of the entire Persian Empire. But they never engaged in the kinds of activities of patronage that we see with the Hellenistic kings. Alexander set a whole new standard for kingship in the Near East, and it was very expensive. The Roman emperors inherit this tradition, and so you're dealing in both the Hellenistic and Roman ages with rulers who are committed to a very high level of expenditure, and that expenditure is more than just military. It fuels the economy, it leads to the development of long-distance trade, and above all, it results in the monetizing of markets, by which I mean coined money becomes the major medium of exchange, which was not the case in the Persian Empire. The Persian kings struck gold coins. They're known as darics in the Greek sources because they carry the image of the king who is identified as Darius I by the Greeks, rightly or wrongly. And those were high expenditure items that could be used to pay Greek mercenaries or big contracts. And Herodotus tells us that the Persians kept bars of gold, and whenever they needed some darics, they'd just, cut blanks off and strike some coins and use them. There were also silver coins in the Persian Empire, but they were largely restricted to Asia Minor. These were known as sigaloi in Greek, or the Hebrew shekel, and they essentially circulated in Western Asia Minor in the old Lydian kingdom. And the Lydians were some of the first people, probably the first people to create coined money. The Greeks got the idea from the Lydians and expanded it. Other silver coinages in the Persian Empire were largely struck by rebel satraps, Phoenician cities, kings of Cyprus, who were in rebellion of the great king and needed the money to pay Greek mercenaries. Big surprise. So when Alexander began capturing large stocks of Persian wealth, specie, and this was in the form of ingots and plate as well as coins, this money was rapidly turned into imperial-style Macedonian coins. That is, silver coins that were either big tetradrachma, which would represent maybe 4 or 5 days' wages for a soldier, and these are large coins which carry the head of Heracles, later identified as Alexander, but it's probably just the head of Heracles, the Zeus on the reverse. It's various silver fractions, the drachma. The tetradrachma is a 4-drachma piece. Numerous copper fractions that were carrying Macedonian symbols and the name or the abbreviated name of Alexander, and gold coins with the head of Athena and the Nike on the reverse. These coins were issued in mints stretching across Asia Minor and the Levant, in Cyprus. Eventually, a mint even opened in Memphis, in Egypt. There were mints established in Babylon and Susa, probably in 325, 324 BC, when Alexander had returned from the east, and he had to coin literally tens of millions of coins to pay off his soldiers at Opis, as well as to pay for the enormous funerary monument ordered for Hephaestion, and all of his other activities, the projected Arabian expedition, the construction of his various colonies, activities of clearing the lower Tigris with canal and dike systems, you name it. All of this cost money. With the outbreak of the Wars of the Successors, you could just imagine how this wealth was rapidly turned into currency. And the result was contractors, soldiers, cities all profited from the Wars of the Successors. By the time that the empire had been carved up into independent kingdoms, the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Kingdom, and the Kingdom of Macedon, there were distinct Macedonian monarchies who were coining their own money, who were making fiscal demands on their subjects, and were committed to this high level of expenditure. They were also establishing Greek cities in their realms, or endowing and encouraging Greek cities in the old Greek homeland, and all of this had major economic consequences. The first scholar to study this whole issue in a monumental work published at the end of his career was a Russian emigre named Michael Rostovtsev. And he wrote a three-volume work called The Social and Economic History of the Hellenistic World. He then followed with a lesser economic and social history of the Roman world. But his really great work was in the Hellenistic age. Very few scholars have known the evidence for economic activity in the Hellenistic age as Michael Rostovtsev. He was a prodigious scholar. He began his publication in Russian and then in 1917 removed to Paris, started publishing in French, and after 1940 removed himself to the United States and ended up with a part of his career at University of Wisconsin at Madison and then at Yale University. In his work, Rostovtsev was the first scholar who considered seriously the archaeological evidence, the vast amount of information gained on trade routes through the excavations of caravan sites in Central Asia, to the sites of Arabia, cities such as Palmyra, well known in the later Roman age, all the information coming from the various Greek-style cities of Asia Minor and Greece. He had a very good knowledge of coins, of inscriptions. Many of the inscriptions record economic arrangements. We have inscriptions, for instance, dealing with the regulations of coins in markets, with the supply of grain to citizens during periods of famine. And this evidence is a vast body of evidence, difficult to make sense of. It includes a lot of physical objects. And furthermore, much of the information that we obtain from this evidence is not reported in the literary sources. As can be easily surmised from the earlier lectures in this series, authors such as Arrian, Plutarch, Curtius Rufus, even Diodorus Siculus in his Universal History, they were interested in great deeds and battles and political events, perhaps in some religious issues, but economic life and social life, which is of great interest to many modern scholars, was really something that was only mentioned in passing, and they simply assumed that their readers understood how trade took place and how coins were used, so there's no need to explain it. Rostovtsev argued, and you have to understand, he is writing as a Russian emigre in the shadow of the Great Depression, the Russian Revolution. He argued that Alexander the Great wrought a new world order in the economic realm. He ended an order of what some economic historians would call a command economy, whereby the Near Eastern monarch commanded resources from his subjects, stockpiled great reserves in his treasury to be used in the event of war or emergencies, and really returned very little of the tribute in the form of expenditures. This was changed into what Rostovtsev would call a capitalist or perhaps a proto-capitalist economy, where markets dictated the movements of goods and services, that labor was increasingly determined by the marketplace, and that the various monarchs who came to rule after Alexander, and in Rostovtsev's Rostovtsev's opinion, it was a good idea that the Macedonian Empire was carved up because it led to a lot more economic activity rather than if Alexander and his heirs had held it as a single empire, that all of this contributed to the development of markets and particularly long-distance trade. Rostovtsev could demonstrate some dramatic instances of the expansion of trade in the 3rd and 2nd century BC, and this is indisputable. The development of the Silk Road that eventually led to China, the whole development of the Erythraean Sea trade in the 2nd and 1st century BC as a result of Ptolemaic exploration and understanding how one can exploit the seasons brought on by the monsoons to establish regular trade between the Indian ports and the cities of the Red Sea and in Ptolemaic Egypt. Caravan trade exploded. The use of camels and of pack animals replacing wheeled vehicles. There's a whole study just dealing with that. Was accelerated. Again, to provide goods, luxuries, in some cases labor in the form of slaves, to the new Macedonian courts and the numerous cities now committed to the expensive life of Greek public activities. Those are temples, festivals, distributions to the citizens. Perhaps the Macedonian kings locked up the swords of the Greek cities. You know, they're not supposed to battle anymore, but they encouraged the civic elites to participate and to express their loyalty and their own ambition by winning recognition in beautifying their cities, carrying out festivals and religious life. We'll be discussing that whole side in an upcoming lecture. And so, in Rostovtsev's opinion, the economic and achievements that came in the wake of Alexander really created a very sophisticated society with monetized markets and a society which was on a whole level of order above what would follow in the early Middle Ages, at least for Western Europe and even to some extent to the Byzantine world. Well, that image of Rostovtsev has come under question, and there's reasons for that. Scholars, particularly writing in the period after the Second World War and applying different types of models to the evidence, they are not as sanguine about the impact of Alexander and those Macedonian kings. In their mind, long-distance trade was primarily in luxury goods, and it could be argued that its impact was relatively limited. It went to the great courts and palaces of the Macedonian kings, or to the very wealthy elites of the leading cities in the Greek world. This would be Athens, which by the end of the 3rd century BC is fast becoming a university and cultural center rather than a political center. A city such as Syracuse and Sicily, that is in the Greek West, which also emerged as a great consumer for products. The cities such as Ephesus, Lysimachus, which is in the Thracian Chersonesus, Pergamon, which is a royal city, or the cities of Cyrene, all cities that emerged as great centers in the Hellenistic age with big populations, they had wealthy elites that wanted to emulate and ape the manners of the Macedonian courts. And this could be, again, documented by very clever studies in ivory and jewelry, decorative arts, which greatly expand in the Hellenistic age because there's a market. In exotic types of tableware, in which not only Greek but various native elements were combined because the great courts wanted to have these objects for display, for the type of social activities before the king, and then, of course, the elites in the independent cities followed suit. So you could just dismiss all of this: silks, decorative arts, fancy exotic animals, one of the items that would appear at the Ptolemaic court. This had a very superficial impact. That perhaps 85% of the population across the Hellenistic world was engaged in subsistence farming. One can point to documentary papyri. These are records on papyri kept by the Ptolemaic kings. They're kept largely in Greek, which becomes the administrative language. But if one reads through these papyri, and again, they're written largely from the government's viewpoint, that is the collection of taxes, the way grain is collected, and I've mentioned before, is very traditionally at the granaries. And it's clear that the leases and arrangements and the means of cultivating the Nile Valley had changed very little over the thousands of years since the Egyptians learned how to exploit the Nile Valley. That life in many Egyptian villages, and certainly life at the nome level, had been altered very little. Traditional religious activities continued, and most of the Egyptians were peasants and were not in a position to buy all of these fancy goods brought in by long-distance trade. The same could be argued to varying degrees in the rest of the Hellenistic world, and the argument could then be that all of this high-level economic activity that attracted the attention of Rostovtsev and his students is really just a thin veneer and doesn't tell us very much about how the majority of residents lived in the Hellenistic world. The other argument that's maintained, besides the minimal impact of trade and the superficiality of the changes wrought by the Macedonian kings and the Greek cities in the Near East, is also an argument that labor continued to be largely slave labor. At least a significant portion of the labor force was slave. This had a debilitating effect, so it's argued, in terms of imaginative economic changes. One does not need to develop labor-saving devices if you have a large body of slaves on hand. And again, this is added in to the mix of why the Hellenistic world, in many ways, was very much an underdeveloped economy. An economy that gave the impression of sophistication because of that veneer at the top level, but really was essentially nothing more than an agrarian society, and some would even go so far to argue that it was a slave society in a Marxist sense, that it was an earlier form of economic organization that would give way to serf and capitalist and other forms of labor later on. Well, these arguments are very much based upon applying certain types of models and theories to the existing evidence. And there is a body of very articulate and well-trained economic historians who would fall in this minimalist camp. I don't share their views, but this is a serious argument, and they do have a number of important points that have been made. Long-distance trade did not affect the lives of those peasants. It's clear that that luxury trade went primarily to the great cities, whether they be Macedonian courts or the great Greek cities such as Athens. On the other hand, it is dangerous to go too far in that direction. All of that trade generated enormous amounts of hard currency. These goods were traded and exchanged, and ultimately coin money was necessary in order to buy and sell these goods. And that monetized markets. Furthermore, the taxes collected on this long-distance trade by the Macedonian kings were extremely lucrative, and they were in hard cash. They were not in cumbersome commodities such as grain, oil, or wine, and it is very easy to underestimate the importance of taxes off trade and manufacturing and licensing, which was paid in coin, as opposed to the traditional taxes, which were largely in kind. And that is a point that is often missed, and it can be brought out very well from the documentary papyri. They could be read in another way. And this has been very, very cleverly done by several papyrologists who have studied these documents from the Hellenistic and early Roman age. And that is the Ptolemaic kings essentially created two means of taxes. One was the traditional grain tax, labor, and commodities that could be exacted from the peasants. On the other hand, they introduced a whole new set of taxes, and these are very well documented in that Xenon archive, which had to be paid in coin. And starting in the reign of Ptolemy I and ending with, say, Cleopatra VII, or perhaps better yet, the Emperor Augustus, the first Roman emperor who incorporated Egypt into the Roman Empire and maintained the Ptolemaic fiscal system, the number of taxes collected in kind vis-a-vis coin shifted from 60% in coin to 60% in kind and 40% in coin to the reverse. That is 60% in coin, 40% in kind. And the Roman emperors would push that even further so that perhaps 75% of all taxes would be collected in coin in the Nile Valley. And those commodities retained were essentially grain and olive oil, something easily reckoned. That these courts and these cities and these elites in the Hellenistic world, they needed hard cash. And ultimately, taxes were increasingly turned over into money taxes. That meant even the subsistence society, the peasants, would have to engage in the market. And they could sell their goods in the Greek-style cities or even in their own villages. Many of them engaged in different types of administrative services, the collection of taxes. There's always the need for guys like sword bearers and archers to intimidate the peasants to pay their taxes. You know, taxes are not paid willingly. There's always coercion and threat, and in the ancient world, there was an enormous amount of coercion, usually taking the form of beating the peasants into paying up. And this is true well into the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. One could read the letters of Gordon in Khartoum and in Equatoria and find the same system being applied in the 19th century as was in the Hellenistic age in Egypt. In any event, this forced changes even at the village level, that peasants would have to engage in more types of economic activities which would gain them money. Furthermore, there is a powerful stimulus in all of this economic development that gets overlooked in the initial debate between Rostovstev's followers and the minimalists who came after him, and that is the role of the Greek city. The Greek cities, many of them rather small, 50,000, 75,000 would be a very big city. 75,000 might have been the size of Ai-Khanoum in Bactria, but many cities were on the order of 5,000, 10,000. We would call them towns. But all of these cities were committed to high expenditure. And that meant the elites in those cities had to put up temples. They engaged in festivals. They distributed grain and coin to their fellow citizens as an indication of their philotomia, that is love of honor, and philopatres, love of homeland. And so the activities in the Greek city-state, which were once focused on war, one expressed his patriotism by warring on one's neighbor, instead was expressed by carrying out building activities and social activities, religious festivals that honored and beautified the city. won you recognition in the eyes of your social peers who sat on the council and the elected officials, won you the approval of your fellow citizens in the assembly, and even brought you to the attention of maybe a monarch like Antiochus III, who might well send a letter and say, gee, you guys are doing a great job. I'm going to make sure that your festival and cult is now on par with the cult of Apollo at Delphi. And that all required money, and that resulted in the development of local markets, regional markets, daily markets, in which peasants from the countryside moved in on regular days, sold their goods in the market, acquired coin and various luxuries, and the city, the ancient city, which is often seen in the minimalist models as a parasite, that is simply a force of oppression, especially if it's a Greek or Greco-Macedonian colony that is sucking the labor and the wealth of the countryside out of the peasants. That's a simplistic view of it. The city was an agent of change. It drew population in periodically for various social events. The peasants brought in their produce. They spent they acquired coin. They spent it in the markets. There were distributions and festivals. And many of those peasants, especially if they qualified as citizens, could participate in the festivals. The relationship was really much more subtle economically and probably comparable to that between a Renaissance city in Italy and its surrounding countryside, the Contado. And so there's this constant interchange between peasants, country population, dwellers in the local villages, the Greeks would call them perioiki and by other terms, and the actual citizens and residents within the city proper. And when one looks at it this way, this was a whole level of regional and local trade, which is extremely important for the development of daily markets and the use of coin money. And that gets me to my very last point, which I want to close with. And that is among the sources are coins, which are an extremely important document for understanding economic relationships. Many of the literary sources tell us almost nothing about how money was manufactured, how it was put into circulation. What was, we only get vague terms of the annual income, and we get anecdotal material about wages. But we have 3 excavations from the Hellenistic age, from early in the Hellenistic age, that show dramatically the impact of the conquest of Alexander the Great. One of them is at Seleucia ad Tigrum, which was excavated in the 1930s. That is in Iraq. The other is at Dura Europos, excavated by a very important team from Yale University. And Rostovtsev knew this excavation because his associates worked at it. And Dura Europos is in Syria on the upper Euphrates. And the final one is at Gordian, where I have been working on the coins that have been recovered in excavation since 1950 by Rodney Young and then by later excavators, notably by Ken Sams. All 3 sites remarkably coincide. They show cities that were not Greek cities. In fact, they were inland. The case of Seleucia, it's a foundation by the Seleucid kings. But Dura and Gordian were both native cities. There are very few coins that come out of the excavations before the arrival of Alexander, and these are usually high valued of some Persian pieces, or in case of Gordian, of some very unusual Lydian coins, which is probably a merchant's hoard. Once we get to the levels that can be associated with the Hellenistic age, the situation changes. We get large numbers of hoards, that is, caches of silver and gold coins set aside by people of high rank. These could be merchants. These could be soldiers. These could be the magistrates of the city. But we have numerous fractional bronze coins, the types of nickels and dimes that would be dropped in the marketplace, and particularly just not worth your bother to recover. That is, you drop a nickel in the parking lot in the middle of the rainstorm, you're just not going to look for it, and this happily, we call this casual loss, which is essentially a scholarly term for someone's bad luck, and we pick these things up. And what they indicate is that very quickly, as a result of the expenditures of Alexander and his successors, that many cities quickly monetized their markets, that daily exchange came to rest on coins rather than just commodities, and that this remained true throughout the Hellenistic age into the Roman age. In the case of Gordian, it's very significant. We know the Galatians, who overran parts of Greece and ended up in Asia Minor, they settled at Gordian. And there's no break in the use of coins. The Galatians simply hired themselves out as mercenaries. They were paid in Seleucid coins. So monetarily, the Galatians were simply part of that wider monetary orbit of the Seleucid Empire, and actually their mercenary service was a way of bringing new money into the city. Since Gordian never coined its own money, all these cities actually had to import their coins from somewhere else. So the evidence is quite dramatic that as an unintended consequence, the economic life of the succeeding Hellenistic world was vastly transformed. And it did form a fundamental economic unity to this area, and above all, remarkable wealth and prosperity, which gained the attraction of the Roman conquerors who crossed the Adriatic in 200 BC to conquer what in their mind were the wealthiest cities in the world.